When tractors first arrived on the scene in America, they didn't just make work easier, they destroyed millions of jobs. And now using that very same logic, that very same idea is happening across America in all sorts of knowledge and white-collar industries. And I don't even think we've begun to grapple with the implications of all of this. And so while the farm was radically shifted by the tractor, our entire society is going to change because of AI. Please allow me to tell you that story.
Stories told with Morgan Gold. With Morgan Gold, it's time for Stories Told.
Just like the technological revolution, the IT revolution gutted blue-collar workers throughout the 90s and beyond, you're now talking about a bloodbath for white-collar workers because of AI.
Half of entry-level white-collar jobs disappearing and 10 to 20% unemployment in the next 1 to 5 years.
All repetitive human work that doesn't require the deep emotional connection between two people, that will all be done in the next couple of decades. Better, cheaper, faster by AI. That is somehow left out of the conversation. It's always about factory robots and self-driving cars. But what they don't talk about is all of the white-collar work that AI is going to do.
Like the car jobs! They took your job! They took your jobs too!
Back in 1900, approximately 40% of the American workforce worked on farms. You're going to look back at that number and say, well, if that's 40%, well, that's almost half the country. And what's interesting is I believe if you look today, less than 2% of the American workforce actually works on farms. A lot of the myth that comes into play when people are thinking about small farms and small farms back in the day, it was this idea that every single one of that group of people, so 40%, whatever that number works out to be with the American population was at the time, I'm not going to try to do the math because I don't do math in public, whatever that number was, that 40%, not all of those folks, those millions of folks, all had small farms and homesteads of their own. A lot of those folks were working on the farms themselves. You know, they were tenant farmers, they were sharecroppers, they were migrants, they might be just simple day laborers. A significant chunk, actually the majority of that 40%, didn't actually own their farm themselves. And so when you start to look at the transition that happened over the course of the 20th century in American agriculture, I think it's important to start from that set of framing and framework because it provides an important context to say, why was it so important for small farmers back in the 1900s to want to save money on labor? It is because a significant portion of their profits was being consumed by the labor that they had to hire to produce the food that they would ultimately sell that was at the core of their farming business.
It's cutting into my profits and it's not good for business.
And so I know that that idea might shatter a little bit of the romanticized Wendell Berry agrarian myth that a lot of folks have in their mind of small farms at the start of the 20th century. But I think it's important to remember that, you know, really across the construct of American agriculture, the position of the American farm worker, as well as even the American farmer to a certain extent, was always a very precarious one. But despite the fact that not everybody had their own small farm and not every small farm was a small family farm where they had 10 kids and those 10 kids were working on the farm, there were a significant number of those and many more than there were today. I mean, even for us here with our small farm in northern Vermont where we've got about 160 acres and I'm actively farming probably about 65 of those acres. The remainder is pretty much just being used as forest and timberland at this point. Back in 1900, the Shaw family who owned this farm and the people who actually built the giant barn, which was built just a little bit before 1900, and you know the folks who took care of this farm and ran it as a dairy, they had a pretty sizable family. I think the first generation of Shaws to live here who bought the place in 1870, I think there was like 6 kids that they had. The second generation, which was, you know, one of the sons of those 6 kids, he actually took the farm over, and I think it was 5 kids that they had living in the house that at this point is just shared by my wife and me. And I bring that example up to you guys because I know for a fact that when I'm thinking about the history and changes of agriculture over the course of the 20th century, what happened here on our farm and even in our tiny little town of Peacham, Vermont, is kind of telling around what happened after the rise of the tractor. Back in 1800, the census marked us at 873 people. By 1810, it was 1,300. That number, stayed about there, and it got to like 1,400 by 1840. By the 1860s, it was about 1,200. By the 1880s, it was about 1,000. And then what you notice is by 1900, it was 794. But what you'll see is over the years, the town shrank to the low water mark of, in 1960, there were 433 people in this town. And when you look at the last census that we had in 2020, it pegs the town at about 715 people. And so what you'll notice is this town has shrunk over the last 200 years, where it had this like spike up and then shrinking down. And so much of that was driven by the shifts in agriculture, because the mechanization of agriculture and really the introduction of the small tractor really changed the type of agriculture people could do in this space. And that affected not just the farm itself, but the entire ecosystem around the farm. In a town with 2,000 people, you needed more blacksmiths and more general stores. You needed more teachers for all the kids in town. But then when you got down to a town of 1,000 people, you needed less of those things. And even a town of 700, there's some of those things that are hard to keep going even to this very day. You really have to travel to one of the next towns over if you even want to go to the store. We have a tiny little community-supported cafe, but that really operates as a nonprofit with very generous support from a lot of folks in town who just want to have a cafe, versus having enough people in town to support a larger business that can be just a more traditional for-profit model. And I think all of that is a very instructive lesson, because what happens is, when you shrink the economic engines of a place, I don't care if it's a town like Peacham or a city like New York, when you shift and change the economic engines that those places have, that has this ripple effect on the entire ecosystem. And one of the things that bothers me the most when I see a lot of the discourse related to AI, between talking about, generative AI and AI, is it art or not? Or is it ethical to write using AI? Or is AI slop creating essentially a dead internet? All of those things are valid conversations to have, but I think they take attention away from probably the most important point around AI, around what's AI going to do to our overall ecosystem? How is it going to shift our economies? How is it going to shift our cultures? How is it going to shift our families? Like, everything about it will change, not because of some direct action of AI, but rather the indirect consequences to what AI will do to the overall human ecosystem. And so for me, that's why the story of what the tractor did to American agriculture, I think, is so instructive. The tractor eliminated jobs, that's a fact. And the tractor set in motion a whole bunch of stuff that we're still seeing play out to this very day. When automation takes away a job, it doesn't just take away a paycheck. It actually starts to unravel other things: communities, places, families, friendships, like all of those things, even purpose, human purpose, like all of those things can be significantly disrupted, and we've got to be thinking about that impact. Looking back on it all, between the years 1850 and 1950, the tractor went from being a non-existent tool to completely ubiquitous across American farms. From the very beginning roots of domesticated agriculture about 9,000 years ago in the Middle East, there was always this role that farming relied on various tools, whether it was hand tools or, pretty quickly, domesticated animals became an important part of how farmers worked the land. And so using oxen or horses to pull plows or drive carts and using those types of things, like, that was all very, very common pretty much through the entire life of agriculture. But as the United States really tried to manifest its destiny over the course of the 19th century, there was a much greater reliance on labor-saving tools relative to pretty much any other point in human agricultural history. Like when you look back at, like, say, the growth of agriculture in Asia or Africa or Europe, what you're going to see is the fact that they were all very human power heavy. They required a lot of people doing a lot of work. So it's not to say that they didn't use animals or tools, but there was a lot of just, muscle power that had to go into really preparing the land and sowing seed and harvesting and like kind of all of that stuff. But when folks came to North America and brought agriculture with them on a much greater scale than had previously been here, what you started to see is the fact that you had way more land than people. Remember, you had, kind of native folks who were doing their own thing, but as, European settlement was going on, what you started to see is folks were essentially coming over here looking to get their own piece of land because there was not a lot of land from where they were coming from, but there were a lot of people. Here we had the opposite issue where there was a whole heck of a lot of land and not a ton of people.
Colonize the colonizer,
And so for the people working that land, having tools like plows and harvesters and that sort of thing became more of an imperative. But plows that were working great in Europe weren't necessarily working great here. Particularly as folks started to migrate further and further west, what they found is that the soil was so thick with roots and was kind of sticky that the traditional European plows would often get like soil stuck on the plow, and then the farmer would have to take the plow out, clean it off, and then put it back in. Well, a blacksmith from not too far from here, just down in Rut, Vegas, a guy by the name of John Deere, he really perfected and introduced this innovation in agriculture known as the self-scouring plow. And so what this essentially was a plow that was like polished steel that really didn't allow for the material to cling to the plow like a more traditional European model plow. And so this self-scouring plow was working great in places like Indiana or Illinois, where, a farmer's labor would shift significantly, where what once would take, say, like 96 hours to prepare an acre for each farmer, it was getting cut down to about 5 hours. And so that time savings allowed a farmer to take on more acreage, which allowed them to produce more, which allowed them to make more. And so it made the land here in the United States more productive. It made the farmer more productive. It was kind of like a win-win. And so farmers here in the United States got very into a lot of these implements. And over the course of the 19th century, you started to see all sorts of things come out of there, from the self-scouring plow to various discs and harrows to smooth out the field after it was plowed, to seeders and planters, to even things like harvesters or reapers, which would allow, the farmer to go through and work their acres much more quickly with much fewer people. And that's what was driving so much of that American growth and productivity in their agriculture. And so by 1870, more than half of Americans considered themselves farmers. And with those farmers, you had roughly 5 million mules and horses doing a lot of the farm work, pretty much anything that required that horsepower. And so as these farming implements became more popular, horse numbers and mule numbers skyrocketed. In 1870, there were about 5 million horses and mules in the United States. But by 1920, that number had swelled up to about 25 million. And that was really on the back of the entire Midwest prairie being converted into farmland. But 25 million horses and mules creates a problem because those horses and mules are hungry and they require care and maintenance. And so there were some problems in terms of how horse and mule dependent the farmers were becoming. And also you had the living creature dilemma of the fact that, a horse could only work really hard for a few hours a day and it would need to rest. Working with horses or oxen even is very, taxing on the human too. And so the human had to do less. And so farmers were still confronted with this problem of how do you be effective growing while at the same time constraining your labor. And so this is the part of the story where the rise of steam power played an important role in American agriculture evolution. And you might hear me say that and say, wow, that's surprising given the fact that there's like no steam power at all happening today. But if you look at like that time period around the 1870s, what you started to see is steam power was playing a bigger and bigger role in American cities where factories more and more were drawing workers from the countryside to work in cities in those factories. And many of those factories were steam powered because it was relatively straightforward to have steam powered boilers firing at your factory. You could get access to the coal or the lumber that you needed to fire the boiler. And that was great because you could just have a big fixed unit in one spot. But in agriculture, it was a lot harder. And so what you started to see is steam power creep into agriculture versus rush in. It kind of started with, steam power driving boats and trains so that the goods from the farms out in the Midwest could be brought back east to where most of the population was. You also started to see probably the first thing to go, which was, when they used to harvest wheat, you would have to thresh all of that wheat by hand. You could actually create locations where you had a steam boiler and you could have steam threshers. And those steam threshers saved a whole heck of a lot of labor. Back in like 1870, it took about 13 men. And yes, in all of the research I wrote, they always referred to it specifically as men. So I'm just staying consistent here. But it took 13 men about an entire day to thresh about 300 bushels. And if you look at when the rise of the steam thresher came by, like, say, the 1890s or so, what you could find is about 1,000 bushels processed a day with far fewer people. And so this was another example of, after 9,000 years of relatively static agricultural production, a real revolution was going on in a relatively short period of time. But the problem with steam power, again, is it required these big boilers. And if you wanted to have like a steam-powered harvester or a plow, which, there were definitely experiments of it, they weren't that popular because you had to warm them up and bring them to temp, and they were constantly breaking down, and they were massive and they were expensive. The big farms and the massive mega farms in, like, say, Iowa or somewhere, they could maybe afford one in their community. But for, tinier farms and homesteads, it made no sense for the farmer to try to explore a device like one of those steam-powered machines. But at the same time, another technology that was starting to rise was the internal combustion engine. With the first auto gas internal combustion engine back, I think in like 1877, what you really started to see is that you now had the ability to create these small portable engines, which were absolutely perfect for agriculture. And so by 1892, an Iowa farmer by the name of John Froelich actually built the first internal combustion engine tractor. And that is when things started to change even faster. And there were manufacturers from all over the country rushing to try to come in and create the perfect small farm tractor. You had International Harvester, you had John Deere, which had been kind of just a manufacturer of tools and plows. Well, they started to get more and more into this space. You had Ford, like Henry Ford was wicked into the idea of building a tractor, so much so that he even felt like he didn't have enough control within Ford Motors. And so he built a separate company called Fordson so that he could make and launch the Fordson Model F tractor back in 1917, which really became the first popular mass-produced tractor. And then in 1924, Farmall produced the first, multi-purpose tractor vehicle, because a lot of these early tractors, I call them tractors, but really you had a self-driven plow, or you had a self-driven cultivator, or you had a self-driven harvester. Each of these things was its own separate thing versus what you see today. And this is important for folks who don't know much about tractors. The reason why tractors are such useful tools for farmers is because what you're able to do with a tractor is harness the power of its massive, powerful engine and use that to run various implements. So on my modern tractor, I have what's known as a PTO, which takes, the running of the engine, and it has this little spinny thing on the back of the engine that you can see that you can hook all sorts of implements to. So, I have a bush hog if I want to cut down thick grass. I have a post auger, so if I want to drill holes in the ground to put posts in the ground. I have a snow blower on the back of my tractor that if I need to clear my driveway, I can just, run that and clear the driveway and all the farm roads. I can do all of those things by using my tractor and just swapping the implements. And then I have front end loader on the front side, which uses hydraulics, which is another power source. And so tractors today are really useful for farmers because you can get all of these attachments, and there's all sorts of manufacturers making these attachments, and you can apply them to your tractor and use the power of the tractor to fire all sorts of devices versus having 20 different tools that you have to buy. Well, this 1924 Farmall general purpose tractor was great for plowing, planting, cultivating. And it was all of these tools and improvements and evolutions that happened over really the late 1800s and early 1900s that led to the shift in tractor use. Just to quantify this a little bit for you guys, in 1915, there were roughly 25,000 tractors in use in the United States. By 1930, it was about 1 million. And then by 1950, it was about 4 million. So you're basically going from zero adoption to about 4 million users in the span of about 35 years. And for those of us who witnessed the ubiquitous rise of the smartphone, that might seem kind of underwhelming, but you have to forget that time moved much slower back then. And it really is remarkable that those 4 million tractors in 1950 accounted for nearly half of all the farms in the United States. And so much like I said earlier, when you make changes to the ecosystem, things start to change. And really the first example I can find around this is, like I said, in the 20s, it was about 25 million horses and mules around the United States. But by 1950, it was down to about 7.6 million. So, just a massive drop in animals required for agriculture in the United States. And replacing those horses with machines meant that you had a lot fewer horses who required a lot fewer feed, which required a lot fewer acres. The reduction in horse numbers was significant because, it took roughly 5 acres of oats and hay per horse per year. And so when you think about that reduction of going from 25 million to about 7.6 million over the span of 30 years, you're talking millions and millions of acres are also being freed up that can be used to grow other products that you can sell with your farm. Now, whether or not this trade makes sense and was positive or negative, I think we are still trying to argue that one out. You think about it, right? Like the amount of impact that like the internal combustion engine has done in terms of climate change and air quality and just, the requirements that have been made to harvest oil from the planet and the destruction that gets caused by stuff like that. Like all of those things are net impacts. But then also remember, America used to have a real manure problem.
Manure! I hate manure!
And we don't have it nearly the same way as we do today. And so much of that is that shift in reliance on the engine versus the horse. And so while the overall ecological impact is clearly debatable, I think, when you look at the efficiency leap, it's not debatable at all. In the pre-mechanized 1800s, it was about 250 to 300 labor hours to produce 100 bushels of wheat. By the mid-20th century, it was a fraction of that time. And by 1976, it took about 3.7 hours of labor to produce 100 bushels. That's like 1% of the time, 100, call it 40, 50 years ago. Think about the productivity that gets created when you're introducing a tool like that, where it's not, it makes you 5 times faster or 10 times faster. We're talking, it makes you 100 times faster nearly in terms of how you can produce that wheat. And you've also freed up a whole bunch of land that was being used by these horses. And you've also probably freed up a whole bunch of time that you had to, spend raising feed for those horses and taking care of those horses. And maybe it was a losing trade because you were now spending more money for equipment and you now had to do equipment maintenance and repair and all of that. But you were saving so much time that, at least for the sales guy at the local tractor dealership, it was a pretty simple business case to make. But all of that reduction in labor meant you had fewer people working in agriculture. Say back in 1800, 75, 80% of Americans were essentially working to produce food for themselves and others. And by 1900, that number was down to about 35%. And the overall output in terms of how much food in general we were producing, that's skyrocketed. I mean, you look at any of those productivity shifts, it was massive. And so labor evolved from being this, family-based subsistence and slavery type model to a mix of tenants, sharecroppers, migrants, hired hands, and mechanization. And that was the change that happened over the 1800s. And now what does that change look like as you look at the communities in the United States? It kind of depended on where you were looking. For example, here in New England, where it was mostly small, diversified family farms using mostly farm family labor, women and children were essential, but by, the late 1800s, it had shifted more and more to just exclusively dairy production in Vermont for, say, a place like Boston or New York City. And that's what drove the outmigration in a place like Peacham, Vermont, because you needed far fewer people in town to produce the same amount of product, if not more product, and then you could ship it much further away. And so the role of farms shifted in the community. And that was a big part of the tractor shift. And so when you look at the numbers that I shared with you at the beginning, talking about my tiny little town's population, the reason for where it was to where it dropped down to, attributable to the tractor. Full stop. And if anybody wants to debate me, go for it down in the comments. But the number one driver in the shrinking population in Peacham, Vermont, over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century was the tractor. You needed far fewer people in a town like ours when you had most of the work being done by a machine. And so that meant the family that had 4 kids didn't need all 4 of those kids to stay in town. They could easily go off to college and go to Boston or New York or California or wherever. And that drove so much of that outmigration from a place like Vermont. And then as you turn your attention across the impact of the rest of the country, I think the story is a little different from place to place. I think something somewhat similar happened in the mid-Atlantic, where you had a lot of those farms producing a lot of food for a lot of the United States in the early 19th century. But as more and more farm and food production moved out west, more of those places essentially industrialized. And that's where you started to get more and more of our bigger American cities and the growth of the Rust Belt and a lot of places like that, where industrial factory production became the focus there versus agriculture, which shifted more and more west. Down in the Southeast, let me tell you, things were drastically different for multiple reasons, because number one, remember, started the 19th century, I'm not going to say all, but pretty much all of the farm labor that you had in most of the cash crop production in the United States, American Southeast, was driven through slavery. When you had the end of the slavery era in the 1860s and the shift from slavery to essentially sharecropping and tenant farming, what you found is that you still had a lot of those labor hands who were enslaved at one point actually now becoming most of the tenant farmers. And just so I'm not just talking out of my brown star here, and I'll quantify it with some numbers for you guys, back in 1900, you had in Mississippi roughly somewhere between 75 and 85% of the farmers there were black farmers versus 36% were white farmers. And so just the sheer number of agriculture being done by black hands back at that time period was still significant. Well, what happened is, as you start to get through the rise of the tractor in the early 1900s, by mid-century, so much of that fueled a big shift in migration as well. And so by the mid-20th century, as you have the rise of the tractor, meaning you don't need to have all of those hired hands, most of the folks who didn't own the land, so the black farmers essentially, drove another massive outmigration, which again, when you see that shift of the descendants of the enslaved folks, or even some of the enslaved folks themselves who were emancipated, they all collectively started to shift away from farming too in mass. And that's where you had a lot of folks moving into those big cities, particularly a lot of those Rust Belt cities I was just talking about, where more and more industrial activity was taking place, where more and more of the jobs were. Those things all happened at the same time. And the tractor was the labor-saving device that fueled that shift and fueled that outmigration in a massive way. And then if you shift your attention to the Midwest, where, agriculture was just essentially becoming the way of life by the end of the 18th century, as I said earlier, tools like John Deere's steel plow or the McCormick reaper, those things started to make agriculture really viable. And that's how, that change of being American prairie to American farmland happened. It was with those tools. And then as you introduced the tractor, that only accelerated further, but with far fewer people. As far as the American Southwest goes, that's probably the place that was impacted by the tractor the least, because most of the agriculture, because it's so arid out there, was more like, grazing and cattle ranching. I mean, heck, back in the 1880s, when a lot of these innovations were starting to be fueled and happening, they were still having like active range wars where people were getting shot and killed over cattle because they were grazing lands that weren't theirs. I mean, if you've ever seen Young Guns 1 or 2, you probably know what I'm talking about.
Yoo-hoo! I'll make you famous.
But the reality is the grazing war era and the range war era of the American Southwest didn't even officially end until they introduced the Taylor Grazing Act back in 1934. And so by that point, the American tractor was already on the path to being ubiquitous. And then one of the more interesting indirect impacts of the tractor in a region was actually out west, particularly California. Because remember, you had what happened in the late 1800s, I think it was 1882, that the Chinese Exclusion Act took place. And so a lot of farm labor up to that point in California was actually from Chinese immigrants and migrants who were working a lot of those fields, either that or they were coming up from Mexico. And so what happened is, because you had a shrinking of labor, you had a greater demand on tools like a tractor or even like steam threshing and that sort of thing. But then on top of that, the tractor created some real problems, particularly in the Midwest. Like, I don't know if you've ever read The Grapes of Wrath or looked at anything that happened in particularly the American 1920s and 30s with the Dust Bowls and what was going on there. But so much of that was directly driven by the tractor, where you had tractors ripping up soil and destroying the prairie soil structure that had been, static and built upon an organic material just built for centuries and eons and like just a massive amount of time. All of that was destroyed in like 50 years when that conversion from American prairie to American farmland happened. And so when that happened, so much of that fueled what created the Dust Bowl. And there were so many people leaving, the Midwest in like the central portion of the United States to go out west and get away from the dust storms and all of the economic failures that were taking place there, partially as a result of those dust storms. Like, there was such an mass migration. Most of those folks went out west, particularly California, and the descendants of those folks are still in California to this very day. And again, that was an indirect result of the tractor. And so the introduction of a technology and a tool creating this massive ripple, changing the landscape and culture of a place, like, it was so significant, and nobody was talking about this concept or idea when they were thinking about the labor saving that came from using something like a steam thresher or a tractor using an internal combustion engine. They were just saying, how do I become more efficient? How do I take care of my land better? How do I make my farm more profitable and make life more stable for my family? I can almost guarantee you that the vast majority of the people who were making the choices that created things like the Dust Bowl weren't doing it because they wanted to create the Dust Bowl or they wanted to try to destroy Oklahoma. No, what they were doing was they were trying to do the best for them and theirs in that period of time, in that moment, with all available information that they had to themselves. And so that's what you saw as the indirect result of the tractor. And now a brief word from our sponsors.
They have no shame. It's a shame they can get away with it. It's a shame what they're doing.
It's a shame what they've done.
I truly believe that one of the biggest problems out there in the world is the death of shame.
It's a shame you can get away with it.
And I care about this so much. I've actually created a homemade zine on the subject of shame, taking many of the concepts that we've explored here in this video and distilling them into a simple little booklet you can print out yourself. It's designed to specifically help spread these ideas offline in a way that algorithms can't touch. You can print copies out at home or even sneak a few off on the copier at work, and you can leave stacks at your local library, the corner coffee shop, your favorite diner, wherever people are gathering and conversations are happening. Because maybe that's the real solution. Less shame and more talking.
Stories told with Morgan Gold. With Morgan Gold, it's time for stories
Welcome back. Over the course of the first half of the 20th century, the number of Americans working on farms, just that number completely collapsed. In 1910, you had about 13.5 million Americans working on farms. And that worked out to be roughly 33% of the overall U.S. workforce. And by 1950, you had 7.5 million Americans working on farms, which worked out to be about 12% of the workforce. And again, if you look at where we are today in 2025, it's something less than 2%. I don't even know the exact number. Fewer and fewer people, and a significantly smaller percentage of the overall U.S. population was working in agriculture, and all of that was a result of the tractor. It also created a significant shift, or maybe it didn't create a significant shift, but it significantly contributed to the shift of about 60% of the American population was rural in 1910 to about 36% by 1950. In a 40-year period of time, that is some massive cultural change and upheaval that we experienced in terms of what it looked like for somebody to earn their living and what it looked like for somebody to work. Which, if you look at where we are today, I would argue we are in a very similar situation, my friends. McKinsey actually said that they expect AI to displace about 400 million to 800 million workers globally by 2030. So that's 5 years from now, not that far at all. And then if you look at that same McKinsey report, what they're going to say is that roughly 1 in 3 American workers are expected to have to change their job type over the course of their career as a direct result of AI impact. And so while you could look at the story of the tractor and start to see some parallels, I think you also have to recognize that there are some fundamental differences that are going to make the next few years even more dramatic than what we saw in a previous century. Because when you compare the change of the tractor versus the change of AI, you're talking about the difference between bronze and brains. Tractors more significantly were reducing the reliance on animals and people to be the physical labor. The machine was being directed by a person who could do so much more work than a team of animals or a team of people could do in the same period of time. And so that was the benefit and value of the tractor. AI at this point, especially as you're seeing most of the development and evolution and the change that we've seen over the last 5 years and we'll probably see over the next 5 years, is much more about knowledge work and making changes to how knowledge work happens. And when you think about the fact that much like the American economy back in the 1800s was a very agriculturally driven economy, the American economy in the 21st century is very much a knowledge-driven economy. I look at myself, right? So I am 45 years old as I'm recording this. And when I entered the workforce in the early 2000s, it was just on the tail of the internet being introduced everywhere. Everybody had a computer and a laptop at the place that I had my first corporate job. There was a reliance on email and Outlook for scheduling and calendars. And a lot of those shifts and changes happened in the 90s, but by the 2000s, they were already kind of fully in place. But at the same time, there were still people in the workforce at the insurance company I had my first corporate job at where, again, this was an old insurance company that's more than 200 years old. They were working there for 40 years. I very specifically remember this one woman who got a job there in the early 1960s, and this was in the early 2000s, that I was actually working in the same department with her. And she would tell me these stories about how they used to measure their productivity for filing forms and reviewing claims, and they'd have stopwatches tracking them for how quickly they did stuff, and those were the productivity metrics in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And even in the 1980s, before the computer systems, the earliest computer systems were coming online for this insurance company, they had these massive warehouses and vaults and filing systems for storing all the claims records and insurance policies. And anytime there was a claim, somebody had to go down there and pull a piece of paper out of these massive filing cabinets. It was crazy to me as somebody in their early 20s hearing all of this in the early 2000s. 2000s, hearing this come from somebody who had like living memory and who had just actual work experience, that like when they were at my point in their career, they were doing this thing that just seemed almost laughably antiquated and kind of ridiculous, but it wasn't that long ago. Now, as I look back on it, right, and I talk to somebody who's like, my age then as I am now, as I talked to somebody in their 20s today and explained what it was like starting work, where even back then there was no real, like, BlackBerries were just starting to be a thing, but they weren't very broadly adopted. It was like the CEO would have a BlackBerry and that's about it. Cell phones were just starting to be adopted by everybody, but the pains of T9 texting made, email review and doing other things like that very complicated. And, you didn't really even have the first smartphones. And, the iPhone came out in 2007. And so like these technological innovations that have absolutely shaped and sculpted the world that we live in today, those didn't even exist back then, yet they were just starting to emerge. When I left my last corporate job back in 2022, the world was almost entirely driven by life on my phone and using my phone to write emails and record videos and give feedback and join meetings from pretty much anywhere. Like all of that stuff was something that would have been unthinkable or really hard to do when I started my career. It really does show you just how much we've become a reliant culture and work culture on knowledge work and what that is and how that is at the core of what we do. And so when you look at a tool like AI and you say, what are going to be the major changes that come from systems and resources like generative AI or general AI, or like, general AI intelligence, like all of that stuff, I don't know. I have almost even a hard time fathoming it. Like, the optimists are going to tell you that like 85 million jobs are going to be displaced, but there's going to be like 97 million jobs that get created. But I think that only works if people are ready to take the leap. The fact of the matter is, as I look at the headlines right now, I feel like we're already seeing the rapid unraveling of white collar work and of knowledge work. They revised the 2023-2024 job numbers, where within those revisions of those numbers, you see 500,000 fewer jobs. Tech and finance and professional services, they've all experienced significant net job losses since early 2023. Based on some of the numbers that I saw when I was researching, in 2023, there were 260,000 tech workers who were laid off. In 2024, there were another 95,000 jobs that were cut. And a lot of those jobs have not come back. And then when you look at what's happening down in Washington over the first half of 2025, essentially what you have is government mirroring a lot of the job cuts that happened over the last couple of years within corporate America. And now I'm not bringing this up to get all political on you guys, but it is unquestionable that the Trump administration has initiated the largest single federal worker cut over the history of the United States of America. And that's what we've seen essentially over the first 6 months of this year. 275,000 employees have been laid off or offered buyouts. Agencies like HHS, Department of Energy, they've all been cut by as much as 50%. Organizations like USAID are completely gone. So like all of these things that were massive employers for knowledge workers are gone. And, some folks are going to chalk it up to government waste, but there's been also a lot of significant AI programs that have started to take rise within the US government as well. And so essentially what you're seeing is the replacement of people with AI workers, and that is shrinking the workforce. And I know there's going to be chuckleheads in the comments who are saying that, the cuts in corporate America, like on the private side or on the federal worker side, are all just a product of a bad economy. But it's not necessarily a bad economy if you're looking at a lot of those traditional metrics. U.S. corporate profits hit record highs in 2024, roughly $4 trillion. Most industry productivity numbers are skyrocketing right now. So again, these companies, like it or not, are doing a lot more with a lot less. In the secret sauce within it all that I don't feel like we're even talking about enough, all of the ways that these things are changing, is coming from AI. And essentially you cut the resource, you cut the role, and then you have the remaining folks figure how to backfill it using some of these new tools available. That is the model that we're seeing right now. This is where I get so frustrated with it, because I don't feel like I'm seeing enough people talk about this specifically. I'm seeing so many debates about whether or not, you're doing the right thing about using an AI artist or not, or whether or not like AI computer usage is going to create a climate change disaster. Like, maybe those are interesting debates, but they're not the most fundamental. They're not the most important to the fabric of American society. But meanwhile, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I'm seeing it manifested in all sorts of weird ways, where like I have lots of friends from corporate America who were like always high performing folks who always really did really well. They have been out of work for long periods of time, longer than they would have expected, like a year or 2 years, 3 years. They are shifting industries, leaving the industry where they built their career for 20 years because they just can't find work anymore in that space, and they're having to go do something else. I mean, crap, it's crazy the number of friends I have right now who should be essentially at the peak of their careers and peak earning years, who are shifting industries and starting over and finding new ways to earn a living because the job that they had that had built their career is gone. And I know you're probably saying, well, it's just because they're mid-career now and they're too expensive. But I know so many people who are just graduating college as well and are just starting out, and they're struggling desperately to try to find a role. They are trying to find ways to go from higher education or even just high school into the employment market. And if they're looking at pretty much anything other than the trades right now, it's going to be really tough sledding for them. And so you have like all of these junior roles that are being cut out. You have all these middle roles that are being cut out. And you just have a lot fewer people that are being needed to work at these companies who are still continuing to earn significant amounts of money and become even more profitable for their investors. And yeah, it's happening because it makes sense for them. I'm not blaming any companies for doing this, by the way. Like, it makes sense. They are doing the thing that makes sense for them. They are acting in their organization's best interest, which most of them probably have a fiduciary responsibility to do. But then when you look at the current American political discourse, and when you look at what's going on and where the attention is, it's not about what are we going to do with this unused labor force and where are we going to go as a society. It's about whether or not trans kids should be playing sports or not. I mean, like, literally, we as a society right now are spending way too much time debating high school athletics and not nearly enough time thinking about how are the kids who are in high school right now, who are going to school, how are they going to figure out ways to build careers for themselves? And I mean, even for the kids in college right now, right? Like, the world is changing so quickly that if you're going to a 4-year institution, the world that it looked like when you started is going to be drastically different than when you graduated 4 years later. And the playbook for how you get a job and how you build a career is going to shift. That there's very little insight that I think your professor is going to offer you to help you find meaningful employment. And yeah, that sucks. And yeah, my heart goes out to you. I also don't know what the heck to say to you, to say, what can you do differently? What should you do? Because nobody right now has a very good answer to this question. Generative AI tools like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or whatever are shifting the world at a lightning speed right now. And much like the tractor, these are general purpose tools that can be performed across a variety of activities, everything from legal to financial to marketing to technology to administration. You know, all of these things are changing because there's such an easier way to do it when you can have a tool like generative AI. And I'm not knocking generative AI here because I actually find value in it myself. You know, I am a small business owner, and between the farm and like the videos and podcasts I do and all that sort of stuff, there are a variety of tasks and jobs that I used to have to do myself and spend even more time doing, or I had actually even hire people to do, that at this point I can now actually rely on something that's like essentially a tractor, where I can just simply take my tractor and connect it to the right implement. And with the powerful PTO of a generative AI platform, I can do the work in a fraction of time. It makes sense for me as the business owner to do it. And I know there's going to be people who scream about this in the ethics of it in the comments. But again, I don't think that that's a useful debate, because this is going to make things move faster. This is making things move faster. That is already happening.
I am inevitable.
And if there is anything I have learned over the course of my life, it's that when it comes to things like this, anything that makes the world go faster, it's like humans are moths to frickin' bug lights. They cannot resist it. They will migrate towards it in mass. Even if you want to resist, eventually you're going to cave. You're just going to cave like slower and later than everybody else. And so just raising your moral objection isn't going to be enough to get people to do things differently. I know that sounds horrible. That sounds jaded, but it's just what I see as very much a realist truth. Some historical context that I have. When I was a kid in the 90s, there was a lot of debate in creative spaces in the art world around the use of things like computers or digital tools, which really weren't happening at scale or at the quality that was necessary. But like, I went to art school. I started in 1998 and I graduated in 2002. And it was essentially the perfect period of time where when they were first teaching us how to use cameras and how to use like editing for film, they had us shooting on 8mm film from like these 8mm film cameras from the 1970s, or 16mm if you like got to the second level. And then they would have us using splicers and tape to cut and edit our film. We weren't using computers. There was no like magical tools or anything. It was quite literally the old-fashioned way that you would edit film for pretty much the first 100 years of cinema or so. But then by the time I graduated college in 2002, what you essentially had was I had an iMac that was in my apartment where I could shoot with a little tiny video camera, and I could edit with that video camera, and I could do it all on my computer in my apartment. That was something I was able to do that would have been unthinkable when I was like, graduating as a senior in high school. And so that was a lot of shift, and that was a lot of change. And so much of the debate was like, oh, well, real artists and real creators aren't, drawing with a stylus on a computer, and real animation doesn't involve computers. And over the course of the first 20 years of the 2000s, that debate kind of went from being like this, well, that's all fake and that's all computer driven and tools like Photoshop are worthless, or tools like After Effects are worthless, to like that became ubiquitous. And what's funny to me today is that like a lot of digital artists today who might not even have been alive at that period of time, or maybe they were just like young children, they see a world where that debate didn't actually exist. And now their debate is that it's unethical to use something like generative AI visual creation because, that's not real art. That's not real creation. When I got to say, as a person who already saw the analog versus digital world debate that happened over the last 20 years of the 20th century, honestly, it just feels ridiculously redundant when I compare it to the AI debate that we're seeing today. It's essentially the same thing. Yeah, you can talk about some of the nuances being different and how generative AI is trained on artists' work who might not have consented. And yeah, I guess we can get into that debate, but in my opinion, it's esoteric and it doesn't matter because it still misses the major point to all of this. It's not that Skynet is going to suddenly become self-aware and try to kill us all. It's that Skynet is going to come and take most of our jobs. And when you have societies with significant mass employment, that is when you have societies with significant mass problems. I think the other thing that very much distresses me about all of this is that when I look at the shift that's happening, it is happening so much faster than what happened with the tractor. Like think about it, right? Like when you have a automation that happens, whether it's with tractors or factories, which I didn't even really talk about today because I just didn't want to get distracted, but like any of those types of automation things that you have, like when you're automating a physical process, it has a certain lack of scalability. You have to build that tractor and you have to sell each of those tractors and you have to train each tractor operator. And so there's like this consistent physical barrier that exists to make that transition from animal agriculture and like, human driven agriculture to mechanically driven agriculture. Like to take that shift, it takes time. And as we really saw, it took about 50 years. You know, in order to make that shift, it took time. And as we saw, it was about 50 years. And so it's a slow transition that's going to happen. And that slow speed of transition allows you to find ways for people to shift. People can leave the country and they can move to the city. People can go from being a farm worker to a factory worker, and that's viable. But when you look at what's happening right now with white collar work and knowledge workers and the shift that's going on with the employment market right now with generative AI, it's happening so gosh darn quickly that I think the ramifications are going to be even more violent. Changing a company from, working using people to do a task to AI to do a task is happening over the course of a year or two. That is happening so quickly that, a kid who starts college is starting in a world that's going to be drastically different than when they graduate 4 years later. That rapid turnover is making it so hard for people to figure out what they should do and where they should go. And while nothing is ever perfectly infinitely scalable, AI is definitely much, much more scalable to the point that it's almost infinitely scalable. To use more AI power, to do more things, you've got levers of improving the quality of the models and how those models work, improving the efficiency of those models, and then improving how those models connect to things, as well as the physical constraint of saying, do you have enough data power and computing power and data centers and energy to run those computers? Those are your constraints. And so you can gut an entire industry in the span of 12 or 24 months and not even see it coming. But if you're going to compare that to a tractor, right? If you're talking about a physical manufactured product and having that product be adopted, you're talking about going from 25,000 tractors to 4 million tractors. That took 35 years or something, right? So think about that shift. That is a slow, long period of change that folks are not going to have right now, and that we can't even agree on the idea that it even exists today. And the human displacement is happening right now way faster than education systems can handle, way faster than social policies can handle or adapt. There's very little evidence that more and more AI tools and resources are creating more and more enough jobs to backfill the ones that are created, or even more so. You're essentially going from saying, you need 10 people versus one person. And so when you're doing shifts like that, it's creating a new type of job, but you're not creating more jobs. And I think people are missing that right now. We are not seeing the creation of more jobs right now, unless you're thinking about it in terms of the fact that you have to have 7 different apps on your phone in 7 different gig companies that you're working with to try to eke out some sort of sustainable living, which is probably not going to be all that sustainable for you anyway. The social contract of work hard and have a good job, and in doing that, you're going to have a stable life and a good home for you and your family. That is broken right now. It doesn't work that way. If you have certain access or if you have certain luck, you can actually kind of get to a place where you can find some of those things. But in general, for a lot of folks right now, that is hard, and it is only getting that much harder. Since the start of COVID, about 60% of overall new wealth has gone to the top 1% of people. It's not coming back to everybody. It's creating greater and greater consolidation, which is actually a lot like what we've seen in farming. Because to bring it back to the farm, right? What happened as a result of the shift and growth of the tractor and the labor saving that creates is what you start to see is farm consolidation. You have fewer and fewer people owning fewer and fewer farms. The average size of those farms is getting bigger and bigger. The tools and equipment and resources that are required are becoming more and more sophisticated and more expensive. That sophistication and expense makes barrier to entry as for entry for new farmers even that much harder. And so you have this cycle that's been going on for almost 150 years or so when it comes to farming that has squeezed out most of the small farmers in America. And that was a result too of the tractor and the scalability, which when it all started, it seemed like a really good deal for those small farmers that they wouldn't need that team of 5 horses and mules and 10 extra farm hands, and they could do the same amount of work with 1 tractor and maybe 2 hands. That shift seemed like a good idea to the small farmer, but that small farmer, that type of small farm, that does not exist in any sort of reasonable scale today. I mean, hell, the only reason I can even pull off the whole agricultural fantasy that I live on a daily basis is because I have things like social media content footing the bill. And when I look at small rural communities like the ones that we have up here in Vermont, these communities are still grappling with the challenges that shift 150 years ago or 100 years ago, or however you want to count it, has happened. We're still grappling with that. To give you an example, right? And I've made whole videos on this topic, but our local school here in our town is in danger of closing because the state is trying to consolidate more schools to cut costs. That consolidation would not be necessary if we just had a few more people living in town. But because there's no viable way to run a small farm in a town like this in mass for enough people, it's never going to get Peacham, Vermont's population numbers back to where they were, say, in the 1840s or 1850s. Farming today looks fundamentally different. I mean, even John Deere, right? John Deere, who is a huge part of the growth of using tools to help improve the efficiency of American culture and agriculture, starting like in the 1830s, but then carrying forward into the early 20th century. And, by the mid 20th century, John Deere, like green tractors were like almost the default color of tractor. And even to this very day, John Deere actually doesn't even talk about themselves as a tractor company anymore, and much more like a technology company.
Our solutions leverage technology like computer vision, advanced sensing and compute, machine learning, and data analytics.
At our core, our purpose is what really helps drive us forward, and we use real technology to deliver on that purpose.
We've quickly become one of the world's leading robotics and AI companies.
Yes, you just heard John Deere executives talking about their business model, much like they were any other Silicon Valley tech company, where they're driving most of their revenue through software sales and device sales and subscription model payments, which when you look at all of those things, unless you have a farm large enough to leverage the scale of those tools and resources broad enough, you're never going to be able to afford. And to be quite honest, my biggest fear, my deepest fear, and it's not really so much for me because I don't know, I feel like I'm established enough and I've been going along enough and I've got enough plan Bs in place that I'm not too worried about it. But definitely when I think about that next generation, like when I think about my nephews, right? Like I am significantly worried for the world that they're going to inherit. And I am worried that they're going to be confined to a life of being digital sharecroppers. And I don't know. That just feels very sad to me. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. I'm going to be starting to publish more of these podcasts again, just because of the time of year. It's so much harder for me to do like the deep dive video essays that I'm typically doing in the wintertime, and because I got to be working outside on the farm. And so what you're going to see are more of these on a more regular basis. I think I'm going to be trying to do the first and third Wednesdays of every month. So be sure to subscribe. Also be sure to check us out on, YouTube for Goldshaw Farm or Morgan Gold if you want more deep dive essays like this. And also, if you're interested in watching another video, you should probably check out one of these other videos on the screen.
Stories told with Morgan Gold. With Morgan Gold, it's time for Stories Told.